Today, we are joined by Kevin T. Taylor, who served as Interim CEO and Chief Financial Officer at Greentown Labs, North America's largest climate tech incubator, supporting over 200 startups. During his time there, he led a major organizational transition, built financial and operational systems, and worked closely with founders, investors, and partners across climate tech ecosystem. Now, through Taylored Stewardship Institute, he focuses on how institutional leaders make decisions and manage long-term responsibility. Kevin, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. And hello to all of your podcast listeners.
My pleasure as well. To start, can you walk us through your role at Greentown Labs and what the organization actually does in practice?
Yes. So when I was working for Greentown, I began as the very first full-time CFO in the history of the organization. So Greentown was founded in the Boston area as an opportunity for persons who were interested in reducing the effect of climate change would be able to come together to work and to learn from one another, to be in community, and to share the costs of operating in a startup. And so Greentown has grown to more than 200 startups across both the Boston and Houston campuses. And I, again, was the CFO. So it is North America's largest. When Prince William and Kate visited the United States in the fall of 2021 or 2022 rather. They came to Greentown as a part of their visit.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Because climate tech incubator sounds clear, but most people don't see what happens behind the scenes. So that was very helpful. Now I would like to talk about what makes climate startups different, or maybe they are not. Because from what you've seen, how are climate startups fundamentally different from typical startups? I'm interested, especially in terms of timelines, maybe capital intensity and risk, unless you have some other factors to juggle in.
Yeah, and so while it's been some time since I've served as the interim CEO, I think the reality is that, like other startups and other sectors, climate tech startups require an intense amount of capital in the beginning. So we had clients that were raising their C, B, and A rounds of funding. There were companies that were being acquired by larger producers, and one of the beauties of being at Greentown is that you could rent a desk space, or you could have access to the prototyping lab, but that access enabled you to be able to use the tools and the resources. And then on top of that, there were opportunities to be able to hone your pitch, to be able to share your ideas before others. And it was the investments that were possible from the partner organizations that Greentown had that helped the startups to be able to accelerate their discovery process and come to market faster, better than they would otherwise. And because space is at a premium in the Boston area, the cost of doing anything in Boston is significant. Having a space where people didn't need to spend their seed funding in desks or in materials, but instead in being able to be in a shared space that everyone could benefit from is one of the beauties of the Greentown model, and enabled many startups to be able to build even more than their hearts desire.
That's very interesting. I would like to also talk about what actually helps such startups versus what doesn't. Because with over 200 startups in the ecosystem, if you could tell us what types of support actually move the needle and what tends to be less useful in your view.
So I think it depends on the type of startup that you are, and what aspect of the climate ecosystem that you are looking to be able to address. But I think the help is in the tooling. So when I was there, Greentown had at least three 3D printers, and when you look at the cost of any one of those, the cost can be exorbitant. And when you look at any one of the tools that are required to create a prototype, so as a startup, you're bringing a prototype to market. You don't want to invest in the tooling, the specialized tooling that would allow for one piece of the part that you are looking to be able to bring to market. And so reducing those costs by shared resources, by being able to use the equipment and the hard working space, all of that is a way to reduce the cost of what you're bringing to market. I think another input that was valuable is the number of opportunities that startups had, both to be able to pitch to potential investors, and so narrowing your pitch, deciding what your target audience would look like, having practice at being able to give those presentations. I think gave the startups a leg up in their ability to be able to move forward. And I just think that by having a prototyping lab, a large open space where the startups could grow and take up more space as their businesses grew, meant that the possibilities of their success were greater. I actually just finished reading a book called The Rainforest, and the Rainforest talks about how venture capitalism and venture capitalists have made Silicon Valley one of the innovation hubs. And it really reminded me a lot of what is happening in Houston through the efforts of Juliana Garziar and others to be able to create space for startups to learn from one another and for them to grow. And so another benefit was you are sitting, shoulder to shoulder with other people who are also working on solving some of the same challenges. You're going to the break room, you're seeing them at the water cooler, or you're in the community with them, and one idea can feed another. So while you have discovered the breakthrough over here, the person down the hall from you might have an opportunity to do something different there. And so it is an ecosystem of innovation that is being developed, and that is what is going to help to not only reduce the impact of climate change, but to be able to also help rebuild our nation's economy, and I would venture to say the world's economy, around clean energy. Because like it or not, climate change is real, and like it or not, climate change is going to affect populations the world over. And so, in order for us to get ahead of it, it is important that we would have the types of resources available in order to help.
Very good examples, and I think our audience will also find this book quite interesting. So we'll make sure to include a link and some references so they can also go and read the book as well if
Thank
they're
you.
interested. Thanks once again for that.
Mhm. Yes.
Now let's talk about funding reality, because as we know, for most of the startups, that's the key question. If you could tell us what are the biggest funding challenges climate startups are facing based on your experience.
Yeah, so based on my experience, it is the risk profile. So several years ago, one of the Silicon Valley banks that was willing to take more risks and therefore started or helped to seed money into startups was one of the banks that folded in the United States, and it was devastating for not just the climate tech startup community community, but the startup community in general. And one of the things that the Rainforest book talks about is that venture capitalists have risk profiles, and sometimes making a bet on a founder or on a founding idea is difficult. And so access to capital, I think, is the biggest challenge that many founders face, particularly founders of color. And while there were only a small group of founders of color, I think the reality is that climate change disproportionately impacts communities of color. And those individuals with ideas are equally as brilliant and valuable to the ecosystem as others, but they just don't have the access to capital. So that's one. I think the second is not having the access to, and we don't call them Rolodexes anymore, but having access to the type of individuals that are able to see their product and to be able to take it forward. So being in a space where you have access to Shell and to Chevron Ventures to Honeywell and some of the other major players in the space is significant because it's not just bringing your product to market. It is understanding that there is a market demand for it, and that what you are looking to bring to the world has market viability, but that there will be a customer base that would be interested in seeing that in that product. And so connecting those two things is important. And so those are two of the things that make the startup community difficult. Access to capital in the very beginning stages, particularly where proof of concept has not yet been established, but also once there is a product worth bringing to market, having the customer base that will enable the return on investment to be realized and for the product to reach the consumer that was intended.
So basically, connections and the money,
So
the two most important things, as always,
yeah,
I would say.
you broke it down better than I could. I could have just started there, right, and said those two things and and been finished. But thank you.
But you put it in a nice way.
Thank you.
And as CFO, how did you balance financial discipline with the mission of supporting early stage innovation? Because that tension exists, I think, in almost every sustainability focused on organization, as we know.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that is at the heart of any startup is the financial picture, at the heart of any LLC or any corporation, and so that was certainly true for Greentown as well. And one of the challenges is that we had staff in both Houston and in Boston, and we also were in the process of moving from a S corp with a public benefit option to a C corp with a public benefit option to a nonprofit entity, and so all of that was a part. And so you want to balance you want to make sure that you are being competitive in the marketplace with salaries and with benefits. And so one of the things that we did was we moved from a PEO model, where we were a part of a national group of organization to purchase our health insurance, to move instead to being able to offer the health insurance ourselves. We looked at everything from the space agreements that we had, but we also looked for revenue opportunities. So there were a number of grants that we applied to and applied for. And fortunately, the state of Massachusetts was very generous and kind in making grants available. But I spoke of Juliana Garzia earlier. One of the things that she did when the Houston office came on board is that she was able to raise, $20 million for Greentown through her philanthropic contacts and from oil and gas, particularly Microsoft and others, to be able to open the Houston office. And so it is a balancing act of being able to sell and to be able to make the philanthropy community aware of the opportunity, but then also to ensure that you're bringing the right talent on board to be able to execute on the vision. And so all of those things went into consideration, and it was a balancing act like any other organization.
So you already answered my second question, the following one, because I was just about to ask you about the transition from a nonprofit, actually the transition to nonprofit, why and what changed. So thanks for that. And I think this is also something many mission-driven organizations struggle with and can relate to. And now let's talk about leading through change that we've just discussed because stepping in as interim CEO, I can imagine during a transition is not easy. So, what were the biggest challenges you had to address, especially when it comes to aligning teams, board, and stakeholders?
So thank you. This is something that I really detail in my book, and it's I think it is a cautionary tale, a case study, so to speak, for other organizations that are looking to go through change. And so the first thing that I'll say is that the CEO stepped down unexpectedly, and so she was the founder, and the organization faced a significant founder's dilemma. And so, to your listening audience that is not yet at a place where they have thought about succession planning, it is something that I encourage every organization to think about, and think about sooner than when you need it, because the organization had been largely led by the vision of my predecessor. And when she stepped down, it left a void. It left a void both in the organization, but also at the board level. And again, the organization wasn't prepared for it. Fortunately, she asked me, a person with CEO experience, a person that had managed $180 million. And so we're talking about 10% of that number being the number of Greentown's budget. She asked me, with my experience, to take over as interim. But from the board's perspective, it felt very much like a shotgun marriage because they weren't left with many other options. And so for me, I knew that if I was going to be the leader, even for a short term, it would be my responsibility to position the organization for success, so that when my successor took over, that they took over an organization that was healthy and strong. And so I made the choice as the leader to do and to make the types of decisions that would enable the organization to grow. And one of those was that I wanted to be able to fix the relationship between the Boston and the Houston offices, because that had created a level of strain since Houston had come on board. And that was, are we operating as a centralized model where the Boston office calls all the shots, or are we operating from a franchise like model where you have the brand name, but there is some level of local control over what it looks like in the different market. And if we're going to expand, getting that right is going to be critical to what it looks like to go forward. And in my charter school experience, we talked about the level of touch. What does it mean for us to be able to get to our consumers and to our schools? And what does that look like depending on where you are? That is the same question that Greentown asked as it was scaling, and that other organizations ask too. So that's one. Secondly, in the early days of any organization, it is very easy for everyone to be involved in decision making. But over time, decisions must be centralized into a smaller group of people, because the organization just becomes too unwieldy for everybody to have input on every decision. And so that was something that the organization was struggling with as well, is, well, I feel like I have a right to know. I used to know and I don't anymore. How do I make the process more transparent? So though you might not be in the room where it happens, you can trust that the information that was used to make the decision was right. The third thing that I was working on was also, the organization had benefited from social promotion. And so if that's not a term that your listeners are concerned with, it's an education based term where kids move from kindergarten to first grade, not because they were ready, but just because that was what was required of them. And so they're socially promoted whether or not they're ready. the same thing was happening within the organization with its staff, in as much as the staff had been promoted without the requisite requirements of what it meant to move from a manager to a director to a VP to a C-level individual. And so someone who has grown up in a system where those are more defined, it was important to me that those would be defined at Greentown also, because it's important that those levels are predictable for every employee, so that it doesn't matter who your manager is or who your C level that you ultimately report to is. It matters instead that you've mastered this set of skills that will enable you to be promoted. So it can't just be, I've been in the organization for 2 years and therefore I deserve a promotion. It must be, I met these criteria and here's what's needed in order for me to move to the next level. Well, as you can imagine, to the people for whom that information was what they were vying for because they saw the inequity, that was a welcome change. But to the people for whom had benefited from the inequity and benefited from the vagueness in the way that the promotions were given, you could see where that would be a level of pushback. And so those were the more loud voices. And if we go back to the idea of it being a shotgun marriage, it made it so that their voices carried more weight with the board than perhaps those who were appreciative of the level of clarity that was being provided.
Makes sense. I totally agree. Thank you very much for those examples. And now I'm also curious what actually improved performance because you implemented a restructuring framework, as I understand. So, what were the specific changes that had the biggest impact in your view? And I would focus, if possible, on what tangibly improved, how the organization operates.
If I go back to the PEO transition, we were able to save money on our payroll processing. That we were able to reduce the rates that people were paying in their health care premiums, and we were able to reinvest the savings into creating um, uh, online processes for onboarding processes, so that when people joined, that we weren't going through a manual process, that we could instead go through, that we could do that in a more automated way. So we reinvested the savings into the organization. And so that was a major change. I think that any organization, when they reach 50 employees or more, they need to consider moving away from a PEO model to their own. Another one that does not have or that had effect is that oftentimes in nonprofits, there is an interest in surveying the staff for satisfaction. And you create your own surveys, you do your own internal data, you compare to your previous years, and then you come up with the questions that you believe would best serve your program. Well, we worked with Gallup, the survey company, one of the largest in the world, in using their Q12 survey that provided benchmarking data against other nonprofits. So we were able to move our employee survey to a third party, and that meant that the quality of the responses could be calibrated against what other people in other nonprofits, other people in industry would do. And so that was important because you can get very myopic in believing that your organization is a special snowflake, that your organization is unique and is like no other. And the reality is that your organization is like a whole bunch of other startups, a whole bunch of other organizations that have been through the level of change that you have, and being able to compare yourself not to yourself, but to that third party is actually helpful in being able to say, actually, we don't have an employee problem. this is normal for an organization our size at this time. And I think it gave an opportunity for the organization to see itself in the mirror in a way that it didn't. The other thing that is be much harder to quantify is the fact that we began a book club, and in that book club we were reading materials that would help benefit the staff. I also convened a group of managers and directors and came together as a training ground because those people would be the people who would ultimately be promoted to senior director and to VP and would one day be members of the executive team. And so if you can provide them with the resources they need to be successful, to be able to manage up, to be able to conduct their one-on-ones in a different way, to ensure that they are getting the most of their experience. If you can do that, you can help the organization to grow long term. And so as interim CEO, those were the things that I thought were necessary, even as we were moving to the nonprofit, necessary to set the organization up for the future.
Very impressive. I hope that our listeners will also start implementing those practices in their organizations. I'll follow the lead 100%.
Thank you.
You've seen climate innovation from the inside, startups, capital, governance, and organization complexity. Let's connect that to what you are doing today. Because I would like to talk now about how Greentown experience shaped your current work. So, if you could tell us, how did your experience at Greentown Labs shape the way you think about leadership and institutional responsibility today?
So today I have, founded my own startup, right? I now have an LLC, Taylored Stewardship Institute, where I am working to coach leaders, to help organizations to be able to steward their responsibility, and to help boards to have the types of conversations that we've just had around making sure that your succession planning is in place, that your board is actively involved in the work of the organization, but does not blur the line between governance and management. That is what the LLC now does. Where Greentown came in to teach me that was in a decision that I made to work with a an oil and gas producer that perhaps not everybody in the ecosystem valued. And so we were already working with Shell, we were working with Chevron joint ventures. We had an opportunity to work with Exxon, a deal that we I didn't get to sign before I left, but I did sign an agreement with Aramco Americas, which is, of course, Saudi Aramco, associated with Saudi Aramco. And Saudi Aramco had put $2 billion into Aramco Americas to be able to focus on clean energy. Now, to the Houston community, again, the world's capital of oil and gas, that was the right move. And because it was the right move, because while legacy oil and gas producers have contributed to the problem, we know that they also have the resources and the raw materials and the wherewithal to be able to bring about change. They have oil rigs in the outermost parts of the world. They've got, and those oil rigs are also capable of being wind farms. Like there is a way to work together. And so if we're going to get out of this mess, it's not going to be the startups alone. There is a dance between as Barbara called it, the dance between the elephants and the mice, but a dance between legacy oil producers and with clean energy. And I'm sure your net zero audience has a whole lot of feelings about what I've just said. Well, I made the choice that we would work with them and that they would sign an agreement to be one of our corporate partners, and that was an agreement that I made because it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing from my perspective as a pastor. That if this organization was willing to come to the table and say, we realize that we made a mistake and we want to now do something to fix it, then who am I to say that you can't? Well, that's what I believe in my heart, and that is what I believe that the scripture tells me, and I believe that's what God asked me to do. But to the purists in the space, that was blasphemous. That was terrible. Kevin, how dare you? This is Saudi Aramco and the Saudis, and we shouldn't be working with them. Well, okay, could be your perspective, but the reality is that's $400,000 that was available to be able to help to make sure that the startup community could be able to grow. They were coming to the table. And so at any rate, that decision ultimately ended up costing me my role with that organization. But it helped me to be able to see that there will be times in your leadership trajectory where you will have to make tough choices. And perhaps that tough choice may cost you your role, cost you your seat, cost you your job. But I may not have the income, and I miss the income, but I do have my integrity in fact intact, and I have my dignity. Now, integrity and dignity don't pay the bills. I'm clear on that. But the question that your listening audience has to decide is, at what point will you allow your integrity to lead? How many decisions have you made and had to look the other way because you knew what you were doing was wrong? The question has to be, as a leader, what are my values and how do my values show up in my work? And so with my LLC, what I'm looking to be able to do is to walk with leaders who are carrying the weight of leadership and feel very alone in doing what needs to be done. And I'm here to tell them that leadership is lonely, but you don't have to be alone. You don't have to go through this by yourself. You're not the first person that has got pushed back. You're not the first person that has been criticized. You're not the first person who has been, up late in the middle of the night deciding whether or not something is the right thing to do. You are not alone. And with that, my hope and my belief is that there are listeners like yours who feel that weight, but feel alone and say, you know what, Kevin, I want to do what you did. Help me to be able to make it through this situation. And I want to walk with them in doing that. But that is shaped from my experience at Greentown, where I made a principled choice. The principled choice cost me my job, but not my integrity.
Still, your past experience was the key and probably the key in your future success because you've seen, after all, these challenges play out in real world conditions, right?
Yes, and I believe out there somewhere is an organization that has said that if he's willing to take a stand like that, if he's willing to do the right thing, even when it costs him, he's the kind of person that I want to work with. He's the kind of person that I believe could help lead our organization to its next level. Dr. King said that the measure of a person is what they do in times of controversy, right? It's not the easy decisions that define us. It's in the moments of controversy that define. And while it was not popular in the moment, I do believe that I was on the right side of history and that history will redeem my choice, even if that was not the truth or not what the purists at Greentown felt.
Precisely. And in your current work, how do you help organizations apply these ideas in practice, especially when dealing with competing priorities?
Well, and so
And let's keep this rooted in real decisions, not just theory. That
I,
would be very useful for our
Absolutely.
audience.
Well, so I think it is so it can be as easy as, and I'm saying easy in naming the example, not easy in the effect of the example, but as easy as the corporate downsizings that we see. So there is the question about whether or not AI will be taking the jobs of individuals and how AI will happen. Well, guess what? Sometimes right sizing an organization, downsizing your staff is the appropriate governance principle that you would need to be able to apply. And so you can choose not to do that to the detriment of the long term health of your organization, or you can choose to do it. The question is how you do it. Are you bringing people into a room and saying today's your last day and you got to go and you're not going to get any benefits? Or are you working with them to either retool their skills or to give them enough runway and severance that they would be able to find another job? Like that is a very practical stewardship decision. We are making this choice to be able to reduce our force, but we're going to do so in a way that respects the humanity of the people for whom we are working. These persons have given their, 9 to 5, their 10 to 6, whatever their schedule is, they have given their lives for this cause. The least we can do is respect them enough by saying, while there is no longer a role for you here, we have provided you with the resources and tools for you to be successful in the next location. That's an example. Another example is, again, from a board perspective. Now let's work through not just our strategic plan, but let's work through what our succession planning is. Let's work through who would be the leader if the leader could not perform. What do we do in emergency situations? Because what that also signals to the staff, so that's a board level conversation. What that signals to the staff is that not only am I not replaceable because I am replaceable, but that we need to have a bench of individuals who can take on the next level role. And how do you develop the bench? By giving people at bats. How do you develop the bench? By teaching them what the next level of leadership will look like. I see in you, the director, that you have the potential to be the senior director. I see in you, senior director, the potential to be the vice president. I want to give you enough practice that with this level of training, you will be prepared for that moment. Because the reality is that if you say that you are a C-level executive, that means that you ought to have a certain level of confidentiality, that you have to have a knowledge of P&L management, that you need to be aware that when you're in the room at the table, that while you represent your function, you are thinking holistically about the organization. The only way that can happen is if you are being prepared along the way. And the only way that the staff knows that that's important is that they see that modeled at the board level by the board saying, and we just need to know what the plan will be when you hit the lotto and are no longer working for us. Not that something bad had to happen, but that you decided that now was the time to be able to step away. Those are the conversations that have to be had. And if you're not having them now, you are doing yourself a disservice, because when the customer comes calling and you've hit the lotto of success with your net zero product, at that point, it will be too late to ramp up your organizational systems. It will be too late to make sure that you have your sexual harassment policy in place and that your benefits that you can offer your fast growing staff to be able to produce your thing. That you've got to put those things in place now. And it may not seem important in this moment, but it is so important if you are going to be successful long term.
Very well said. And what are the most common mistakes that you see organizations making when it comes to long-term decisions? You've just mentioned how long-term decision making is important. So let's focus on long-term decision making and responsibility, of course, especially in sustainability and climate-related strategies.
So I think one is assuming that the decision that you make today is only applicable for today, and while it may have been your best choice, that it is that you are choosing only to think in your short-sightedness, because thinking short-sighted means that the long-term consequence is that unless that changes, it now becomes the governing practice for the organization. And so that we saw that with the social promotions, but it's also true of other aspects of the business. So you want to have those pieces in place. I think the second mistake is involving everybody in every decision. I think it's as quickly as is possible for you to not not to develop a trusted set of individuals, but for you to define the decision making process that people's input does not equal decision making rights. Meaning, just because I raise my hand to say, I think we should, does not necessarily mean that we will. And if I don't, it's not because I don't like you or that your idea was bad. It was that the decision was not yours, it was mine. That is an important thing that people need to get right in the beginning. Another is revisiting decisions that have been made because the decisions have been written down. One of the things that I detail in my book is what I call the recommendation chart. And that chart simply shows exactly what the issue is that you're confronting, what the danger of inaction is, because inaction is also a decision, and then what the options are. So, here's option 1, 2, and 3. Here are the pros and the cons. And we made the choice based on this, and the choice was this. Well, what a lot of organizations fail to do is to write that down. And it matters for two reasons. One, people's memories fade. So if you weren't in the room where it happened, if it wasn't written down, you don't know what was thought of or what considerations were made. And as a result, when people's memories fade, I thought that you said, or I remember when, or you're telling the story of what happened in the room through your own jaded lens. Well, if you wrote it down, it is an artifact that can be revisited. And for you to decide whether or not the decision that you made brought about the change that you thought that it was. And now, in the age of AI, you can use AI to pressure test your decisions, right? So, have I captured enough pros and cons? Is there another decision that I shouldn't be considering? But more than that, machine learning means that you tell the machine what actually happened so that it can learn to do better. Organizationally, you need to revisit the decisions to see, did I have enough inputs in place to be able to make the right decision? Was what I thought going to happen? Because oftentimes decisions are made quickly with not a lot of information. But let's revisit those and revisit them not from the subjective view of what I thought, but of the objective view of what was available to me in that time. And so I think that is a critical practice that if you start early, that you are able to then review decisions again objectively to then learn to do better. Because any budget, any decision is your best guess at that point in time. And the question then becomes, what can I do to guess better? And the answer to that question is with as much information as I can. So I need to know the nuance. I need to think through the possibilities. That's how I'm going to get to my best guess. And that will be my choice. And that choice might bring about the change that I want. But if it failed, I want to know why and go back to that decision to see what my input was that was wrong. That is how innovation happens. That's how we get to the products that we are looking to be able to sell. But that's also how organizations can grow and can move. And again, in the age of AI, you have a thought partner that you didn't otherwise have.
The first example also struck me because I've heard it a few times already, and I also tried to preach it. People shouldn't be married to their ideas. These are two different things. So yes, if even something is against your idea or they are not following your ideas, it doesn't mean that they don't like you. Just as you said, and then staying well informed. This is very crucial. I totally agree. And for companies listening to this, what are, let's say, two, three practical things they should do differently based on what you've learned? Something they can actually apply without overcomplicating things.
Hmm. I think they can outsource their employee survey data. to a third party where there is no one person in your organization that is coming up with questions, no one person in your organization that is laboring to be able to come up with the results, but can provide your management team with real world or real live data that is comparable to other organizations your size, whether you are a corporation or a nonprofit. I think that's one. I think the second is um, disassociating yourself with the belief that your organization is so special that that it does not mirror anything else. And so if you are and that's not to suggest that what you are producing is not unique in the marketplace, but recognize yourself in the continuum of business development, that you are not the only organization that has ever been the size that you are. And you are not the only organization that has aspirations to the millions of billions that dollars you expect to be able to reap. And so what can you learn from the examples of other companies, and what can you learn from the mistakes of other companies that may not necessarily be in the same business that you were in, but were in a similar position? And so one of the best books for that is a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. And yes, it details 10 companies that were successful and 10 that failed. Not one of them is in the clean energy space, not one. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lessons to learn about what those companies did and what they didn't in order to be able to be successful. And so imagine yourself as, in a updated model of good to great. You want to be on one of the success stories, not one of the failures. And so you want to know and not make those same mistakes. You want to learn from others. So don't be so myopic that you are not willing to say there are lessons to be learned from other industries, other experiences. And look, that didn't cost you much at all, except for being on the phone with Gallup to be able to do your surveys and to buy all your staff a copy of a book. That's a small investment with a true long-term gain.
And many times the road to success is actually paved with failures, as we know.
Absolutely. And you can learn so much more from your failures sometimes than your successes.
Exactly. And actually, how you approach the failure and what you do afterwards, this is what actually matters.
Absolutely.
And before we wrap up, is there anything important we didn't cover that you think companies or investors should be paying more attention to right now?
I think we covered it. I think the market is changing and is rapidly growing. I think that it is also true that if we were going to focus our area of concentration, it would be around women and other underserved communities. That while the startup universe right now is predominantly white men, it is not the only group of people who have ideas on being able to reduce the effects of climate change. And one might say, well, why are we singling them out? Do they matter more? The answer is not in do they matter more. The answer is in what are the level of supports that are needed to ensure that they have a fighting chance to be successful. And so if we go back to the idea of the rainforest requires all types of animal life and plant life in order to be successful. And in this ecosystem of reducing climate change, it's going to take all types. And so just like I want for the largest tree to grow, I also want to make sure that the most beautiful flower is also able to grow. Because when that does, the rainforest is able to do what it is to do. And so let us not forget in this process those persons of color who may not have access to the startup capital. Let's not forget the women who have great ideas, but perhaps don't have the same level of access that the male counterparts may have. Those persons deserve to be at the table too. And if we are not making space for them, if we are not willing to diversify, then we are only reinforcing the same types of problems that we are fighting against in this battle with oil and gas.
Great metaphor with the rainforest. I like that. Kevin,
Thank you.
thank you for the conversation. This was a very practical look at how climate innovation ecosystems operate and how those experiences translate into better decision making at the institutional level. So, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, we started publishing a weekly newsletter covering the most relevant developments from the past week across sustainability, energy, and climate tech. You can subscribe for free, and more information is available on our website, netzerocompare.com. And we also make sure to include all the links and references to the books that Kevin mentioned today. Thank you.
Thank you.